Hey guys, welcome back to the Biomechanics of Exercise series. In today's video, we're going to talk about the function and the motion of the hip. So the hip has a lot of different available ranges of motion that we'll cover here in a minute, and it's a really key joint in terms of athletic performance and fitness. So we'll dive into a couple of those concepts here today. But first, let's start with the motions. So when it comes to range of motion at the hip is kind of similar to the shoulder in that it's that ball and socket joint, and it has a lot of degrees of freedom in terms of how it moves. So let's go over the motions that can be achieved at the hip and some of the muscles that are responsible for those motions. Okay. So I'm going to start with hip flexion. Okay. Hip flexion is bringing the knee up like this. All right. So I'm reducing the angle of the hip. All right. Just like this. This motion is achieved by the rectus femoris as well as the iliopsoas primarily. Okay. The other sagittal plane motion is going to be extension. So now the other way. That's bringing the hip backwards like this. That's mainly achieved by the glute max as well as the hamstring group. Okay. So hip extension. All right. The next motion we're going to talk about is coronal plane abduction and adduction. Okay. So when I move the hip out laterally this way, or the foot out laterally this way, that's hip abduction. And that's achieved primarily from the glute med. Hip adduction, adduction, is moving the foot inward towards midline like this. That's achieved by adductor magnus, adductor longus, and adductor brevis, kind of on the inner thigh here, as well as some of the other groin musculature. Okay. The other plane of motion we want to talk about is the transverse plane of motion, so rotational movements. Okay, so if I externally rotate, that would make the toe go outwards this way. That motion is achieved by the piriformis, as well as a bunch of the external rotators, including the superior and inferior gemellus, as well as a couple other muscles. Okay, external rotation like that. And then the other motion is internal rotation, so turning the toe inward. This is achieved by the tensor fasciae lata muscle, as well as the glute minimus, as well as a couple other muscles. Okay. Now there's also circumduction, which is essentially a circular motion of the hip, which includes all of those motions. So if I were to make a big circle with my foot like this, that would be considered a hip circumduction. Okay. So now we're going to talk about a little bit more about the function now that we understand the action and the muscles at work. So let's take a look at the function. So the main function of the hip is to provide a hub of stability to really the entire lower extremity. The hip is essentially the connector of the lower extremity kind of to the spine and pelvis area. And when it comes to gait cycle or athletic movements, the hip is kind of that one of those main force producers that's going to help, accomplish a movement, achieve gait cycle, things like that. One of the main structures that provides some of that stability is the labrum of the hip. So just like the labrum in the shoulder, the labrum of the hip basically lines the acetabulum and helps to hold the femoral head in place, as well as increase the surface area that the femoral head has with the acetabulum. In doing that, it creates more stability at the joint and helps to basically keep the joint where it needs to be, as opposed to kind of letting it move freely throughout the acetabulum. Okay, so labrum is super important. When it comes to things like gait cycle, okay, the hip plays a huge role in terms of obviously lifting the leg up to take a step, as well as propelling the body forward as I walk. Okay, so just like when we talked about the motions, we're flexing the hip, making contact with the ground, and then we're extending the hip. So if there's any dysfunction in the hip itself, you're going to see that in gait cycle many times, and that's why it's common to check gait cycle in the clinic, with a hip condition. Okay. In terms of the overall kind of positioning of the hips, when we talk about gait cycle and even athletic movements, I want to reference back to anteversion and retroversion. Okay. So we talked about this in the last video, but we want to talk about more of the functional implications of anteversion and retroversion. Okay. So right here we have an anteverted hip. Remember, anteversion means that the angle of the femoral head and neck to the femur is an acute angle. Okay, so this position of the toe, this toed-in position here, is what the foot would look like without any compensation. Okay, now most people aren't going to walk around with their toe in like that or their feet in like that, so they are going to externally rotate at the hip, okay, which will correct the toe position to be straight forward. but that's going to lead to chronically tight external rotators of the hip, so those muscles we talked about earlier, as well as an inability to actively externally rotate, because just to get to neutral, they're already working really hard just to pull the foot to neutral, okay? So if we flip that situation to retroversion, we have the angle of the femoral head and neck to the femur being obtuse now, so larger than 90, and the toe kind of pushing outwards this way. The opposite situation is now true for the hip. So the internal rotators, okay, internal rotators, so rotating inward, are going to be working really hard to pull the foot to neutral, all right? And that's going to lead to a lack of active internal rotation, as well as really tight and stiff internal rotators, okay? So you can imagine when the toes are going in both directions here, that has a very large implication, obviously, on our everyday life, and especially in gait cycle, okay? So that's kind of how the hip functions in everyday life, you know, gait cycle, things like that. Now let's jump into some more of the exercise and fitness applications of the hip. So one of the most important ways that we generate force in fitness and in sports is through hip extension. So if you recall from earlier, hip extension is where the glutes and hamstring muscles basically propel the hips forward. And like I said, that's one of the main ways we can propel ourselves, whether it's in a linear direction, whether it's vertical, whether it's laterally. Hip extension is a main player, okay? So let's take a look at two sport examples where the athlete's needing triple extension through the ankle, knee, and hip, and kind of how the hip plays a major role in triple extension, okay? So in terms of Olympic weightlifting, we have our lifter here doing the snatch lift, and in the starting position here, he's pretty flexed in terms of his ankle, his knee, and his hip, all right? But in bringing the bar up to the knee, the ankle, knee, and hip are already starting to extend and kind of lift the bar up and off the ground. And that last little bit from the knee to the hip is where that hip extension piece really kicks in and becomes very powerful, okay? So as the bar kind of approximates the hip and the hip extends into the bar is gonna be shot upward, and then we're going to catch it in that overhead position. But really, that hip extending forward at the very end piece is what provides the force necessary to get that bar up, okay? Without that hip extending real forcefully, that bar is going to get stuck at the hip and go right back down, okay? So in Olympic weightlifting and really all barbell sports, hip extension is a key component of the lifts, okay? When we take a look at the sprinter here coming out of the blocks, we see that the ankle, knee, and hip are now also in that similar flexed position, similar to the beginning of the snatch, okay? And as that runner or sprinter comes out of the blocks like that, he's required to extend at the ankle, knee, and hip again, okay? And he's going to drive that hip up and then extend the hip down, kind of throwing his foot back into the ground and propelling him forward, okay? So it's a little bit different application because we're moving the body in a linear direction now, but the same concepts of triple extension through the ankle, knee, and especially the hip still apply to sprinting, okay? So it should be noted that the muscles that create hip extension, so the hamstrings and glutes, are pretty much the strongest muscles in your body, and that highlights the importance of hip extension not only in sports but also in our everyday function, okay? So obviously we know triple extension and specifically hip extension is super important, but now let's take a look at how the hip plays a major role in some other sports movements that allow us to produce forces in other directions.
Okay, so we're going to take a look at a baseball swing for hip functionality here, okay? So we're starting out in a standard batting stance. Now as he starts to begin the swing, he steps back onto his back leg and loads up a lot of the weight onto that hip, as you can see right here, okay? That's creating a lot of potential energy. Now, as he starts to move forward, he starts to externally rotate that front hip, right? And he lands just like that. As he pushes off that back leg, he starts to come through, creating a lot of torque right at that moment of impact, right? And all that torque at that moment of impact, as he rotates the hip and pushes off that back foot, is going to generate the force that he needs to finish the swing, thus unloading on the baseball.
So if you stuck with us this long, you should have a much better idea of kind of how the hip functions not only in sports but in our everyday life. And it was kind of cool. In making this video, it gave us a bunch of new ideas in terms of other biomechanics videos and hip function videos that we're going to make in the future. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave a comment and a like below, and we'll see you in the next one.